Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Here we
All
are.
right, guys. I think it is recording. Let me just make sure. Yes. Okay. So we have reached the last lecture of the series, and um, it's the last chapter as well of Ruth. And then we will chat more about the next series. And as I say, this is going to be my final series in lecturing in the way I've been doing it for a few years now. I'm thinking of doing it in a different way. But I will keep you in contact with the way I'm going to do it after this series of lectures, the next one, which we're going to start on the 11th of September, and it will be a seven week series, and we'll talk about it right at the end. Also, if we get kicked out and we go to session 2, unfortunately for whatever reason, I had to update Zoom, and it gives I need to spend 10 minutes between the two sessions. I can't do one session after another. The only way I can do it is if I pay for Zoom, which is not very cheap. So if we do get kicked out, then please wait 10 minutes and then go and have a cup of coffee or make yourself a cup of coffee, and then we will go into session 2. Right. Okay.
Okay.
So
Yes.
in this final lecture of our series on the book of Ruth, even though we've already dealt with the climatic moment of the story, we're going to explore something at the end of Ruth that is shocking and unexpected. And it gives us a window into the character of God and how God means for us to live our lives in a really unique and compelling way. So let's dive into our last lecture. All great story followers, all great stories follows a similar pattern, and they're built to what I talk about in the last lecture, a climatic moment. And majority of stories like that. So obviously not biographies, but mysteries, romance, all of that. There is that climatic moment that the book builds up to. And we saw that with Boaz at the city gate, where he ultimately redeems Ruth. But I want you to just kind of see a typical storyline for a story. And it will often begin in a place of normalcy, where everything is settled, everything is okay. But then there is this inciting incident that would launch the main character, the hero of the story, on this journey. And so when you look at the story of Ruth, that inciting incident is the experience of the famine and death right in the beginning of the story. And then the way that the story functions from there is you have this rising and falling action that builds tension and resolving it and so on, and builds it and builds more tension and then resolving it and so on in the story. Um, and it builds to this climatic moment where that tension is resolved and the core problem of the story is solved right at the end. Now, in most stories, after the climatic moment, it's follows by what is called the falling action, where loose ends get tied up and you get to appreciate the new normal for the hero. So, for example, and they live happily ever after, then you're assuming that everything has been sorted and this is the new normal for the couple or for the hero and the ride into the sunset. But that's not what happened in the story of Ruth. Ruth reaches its climatic moment, but then it goes someplace unexpected and, in my opinion, really, really exciting. And he does that through, are you ready? A genealogy. Now, lest you think all those begets are boring, let me introduce you to a woman named Alice Klubach. Alice Klubach was gifted an Ancestry.com DNA kit in 2012. which is like a website where you can go and find out about your ancestry background or your roots. And so, out of curiosity, she took the test, sent it away, and a month or so later, she got her result back. But there was just one problem. This couldn't possibly be her test. So she took another test, sent it back, waited a month or so. The result came back again, same thing. The problem was this: Alice had grown up in a staunch Irish Catholic family, but her genealogy, her DNA results were suggesting that she was actually half Jewish. Okay. Now, this launched Alice and her family on a 5-year investigation that culminated in the discovery that her father, Jim Collins, in 1913 had been sent home from the hospital with the wrong family. So an Irish baby went home with a Jewish family, and a Jewish baby went home with an Irish family. And all of this came out because Alice got curious about her genealogy. Quite a story, eh? And there's things like Ancestry.com or 23andMe and DNA testing becomes more and more popular, and you can get that on the internet. These sorts of things are becoming more commonplace. In fact, genetic genealogist C.C. Moore says, we see it every day. You find out that a lot of things are not as they seem. A lot of families are much more complex than you assume. So don't assume that a genealogy is a boring thing. So as we look at the genealogy that finishes the book of Ruth, I want you to just in your mind contextualize the speaking. Think of a genealogy as the ancient literary equivalent of a high-speed car chase. And the genealogy at the end of Ruth does not disappoint. So let's look at Ruth chapter 4, verse 18 to 22 and dive into this genealogy. Now, these are the descendants of Perez. Perez became the father of Azron, Azron of Ram, Ram of Aminadab, Aminadab of Nahshon, Nahshon of Solomon, Solomon of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of, and here's a word that you're probably familiar with, a name that you're probably familiar with, and Jesse of David. Okay? So we know that one. We know David, the greatest king of Israel in the Hebrew scripture, a man after God's own heart. Now, what is so surprising and so satisfying about this genealogy as an end to the story of Ruth is that if you remember back at Ruth chapter 1, we learn that the book of Ruth is set in a time of Judges. And I said how when you look back into Judges 21-25, you get this kind of thesis statement about what the time of Judges was like. Remember, it says it was a time when there was no king in Israel, and all the people did what was right in their own eyes. But we have just walked through a story where Boaz and Ruth don't do what's right in their own eyes. They do what's right in God's eyes. So they are dramatically different from the culture around them. And their love and their loyalty and the faithfulness in light, not only in Naomi's darkness, it's light in the darkness of the nation of Israel. We get to the end of the story of the book of Ruth, and we are hoping, we are expecting that God is going to redeem Naomi by providing her with an heir, providing her with a grandchild. And instead, what we find is that God doesn't redeem a family, He redeems an entire nation. But it gets better because this genealogy at the end of Ruth is going to get picked up in an incorporated by Matthew in Matthew chapter 1 into Jesus' genealogy. Okay? So I want to read for you just a couple of verses from that genealogy and start to unpack some of the surprises that are in there. So verse 5, Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab, Boaz, the father of Boaz, by Ruth, Obed, the father of Jesse, Jesse, the father of King David. And then we skip down to verse 16. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. So this is now from Matthew. Now, obviously, for the purpose of space, I've highlighted just the portions of Jesus' genealogy where you see Boaz and Ruth. But if you were to zoom out and read the entire genealogy, a couple of things really jump out at you. The first is that in Jesus' genealogy, there are 5 women, and this is highly unusual. You typically don't see women in a genealogist unless they are a matriarch. And none of the women in the genealogy of Jesus are that at all. So you have these women who are outsiders who are included in the genealogy. And then you get this concept of not just these women, but many of these women are Gentile. Tamar is a Canaanite. Ruth is a Moabite. Rahab, again, is a Canaanite. I mean, these were hated people by the Israelites. And I think a part of Matthew, what Matthew is doing, he wants us to see that Jesus is going to be the kind of Messiah who becomes outsider, who makes space for the marginalized in his life. And of course, he does that because it's in his genealogy. And if you are going to do the next series, when we look at Jesus in the Galilee, we will see how often Jesus actually goes to those who were the outsiders, to those who were not of the Jewish faith. Jesus comes from a long line of outsiders. And then the third thing that's worth pointing out, and I mentioned this in the previous lectures, is just this connection between Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute of Jericho, and Boaz. And I think what Matthew again wants us to see is that Rahab is a foreign woman whose action preserved the people of Israel. And you think to yourself, well, wait, if that was Boaz's mother, of course Boaz is going to be the kind of person who sees Ruth, a foreigner, a Moabite, whose actions are preserving Naomi, this Israelite. Of course, he's going to make space in his life for her. That's his story. That's his heritage. That's the way he has grown up, knowing that his mom was Rahab, the prostitute, the one who saved not just the spies, but literally a nation. One of the commentators that I've so enjoyed reading from as we go through the series of the book of Ruth and many others is Dr. Ann Taylor. And she writes this about Boaz. She says, Boaz models God's vision of generous inclusion and acceptance and points us to Jesus who fed the hungry, ministered to those in need, and embraced the marginalized. And all of that is coming to us through Jesus' genealogy. So we get to the end of the story of Ruth, and we are hoping, we are expecting that there's going to be this redemption for Naomi, and we are surprised that there is in fact a redemption for Israel as a nation. And through Israel, there's a redemption for the whole world through the Messiah, Jesus. And I think that the thing is that we could say about the story of Ruth and about our own lives is that very often God is working in ways far beyond our comprehension. Anyone have anything to say?
Except wow.
Except wow, yeah. Well put there, Mike. Well put. Yeah. Now, if I look at my own life, I will often get all twisted up in knots, worried about some specific outcomes, so specific circumstances. And very often I get to the end of the story and I see that God was doing something something way bigger without me knowing, far larger than I could have even imagined. It's like God has this bigger purpose of which I knew nothing about. I think that this is why faithfulness, like you see with Ruth, like you see with Boaz, is so challenging because very often God's saving activity, God's presence, is not readily apparent. Okay, we want to believe, we want to trust, but we just constantly get bogged down by the circumstances around us. So in Ruth chapter 4, verse 13, there is this interesting detail when Boaz takes Ruth and she becomes his wife. When they come together, the text actually says the Lord made her conceive and she bore a son. Now, commentators across the spectrum, both Jewish commentators, Christian commentators, they all say this is interesting because even though there are a lot of talk about God in the story of Ruth, there are only two places in the story where God directly intervenes in order to bring something about. And this is one of those when Ruth conceives and bears a son. The other place that God does this is back in Ruth chapter 1 when God remembers or considers his people in Bethlehem and he gives them food. Other than that, there is an implication of God, but God is not directly mentioned. And so a number of scholars have looked at the story of Ruth and just came to this conclusion that in the story of Ruth, the God of Israel is at best hidden in a narrative. And at some level is also a story about the hiddenness of God. Hiddenness, not absent. So that's big difference, okay? God is not absent in it. He is hidden from the narrative. Very similar as well in the book of Esther, the story of Esther, the scroll of Esther. God is hidden out of plain sight, but he's not absent. He is doing his big picture kind of thing. And when you hold those difference between God's hiddenness versus God's absence, you can go through the story and start to see things a little different. So, for example, back at Ruth chapter 1, Naomi and Ruth, they arrive back in Bethlehem. Naomi is despondent. Remember, she said, don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant, but call me Mara, which means bitterness. It's almost like she's just sitting there overwhelmed with the loss. But Ruth is saying, I'm not just going to sit here. I've got to find some food, right? Remember that? And so she makes this decision to go out and she appears to just choose a field at random where she could walk behind the reapers and they are gathering grain. And in Ruth chapter 2, verse 3, you find this little detail. So when she came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers, and as it happened, okay, there's a bit of a humor in here. It's almost like the writer is like, not, wink, wink. What a coincidence. It just happened. She hands up in the field of the one man who ultimately going to save her, right? And so you look back at the time, this just seems like a coincidence. But now, when you look at Ruth chapter 4, this pivotal scene at the city gate, something very similar happens. Now, before Boaz shows up at the city gate, the night before, he has this pivotal conversation with Ruth. Remember, we spoke about the threshing floor, and it's there where he hatches this plan for how he's going to try to be the one who redeems her. Sorry, someone asking me a question.
Mm-hmm.
Was someone trying to ask me a question?
No, I think my phone just went. I got a message.
Okay, all right, okay. So what I was saying is, remember they were having a conversation, a pivotal conversation, Boaz and Ruth at the threshing floor, and it was there that he was hatching this plan that he's going to try to be the one who redeems her. Well, when chapter 4 starts in the very next verse, this is what we read. No sooner had Boaz gone up to the gate and sat down there, than the next of kin whom Boaz had spoken of came passing by. Once again, it's like this grand coincidence. Wink, wink, say no more. The coincidences are really coincidences, aren't they? I mean, it just so happened that the same guy that he was telling Ruth, he just seemed to have been walking past. And here's what I want to say to you about God's hidden activity in our stories, is that so often when we're going through difficult things, we completely miss those little glimpses of God's presence. And we usually miss them because we are focused on our circumstances. We are so twisted and tied up in knots about what's happening around us that it's like our eyes are shut to God's presence in our story. Am I right, guys?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going through that at the moment. We, on a daily basis, we go through these kind of things of not necessarily doubting God. What we spoke about yesterday at the Hill in the sermon, but there is this thing. You've heard me say that Christians should never be under the circumstances. They should always be above the circumstances. And often we find ourselves under the circumstances. We want the solution to happen now, right now, and our way. And God is saying, wait a minute. Maybe there is something else happening in the background. Maybe there is something else that I want to do at the same time as you've asked me to work on this particular circumstances. And very often it's not until we get through whatever the hardship is that we are able to look back with eyesight and say, oh, okay, I can see now where God was in that moment. I can see how God was leading and guiding and shaping me. But what if I told you you didn't have to live with hindsight? What if I told you it was possible to live through whatever you are going through with a kind of a spiritual foresight that allows you, that gave you eyes to amplify the unseen way that God is present with and showing up in the world? Are you wanting to find out?
Indeed.
Hey, all right. So there's $1 million, $1 million solution. And the way that you do that is you turn your attention off your own circumstances and you start to trust God and God's character. Okay? So we know that. I mean, this is a part of Christianity. This is what the Lord is telling us to do all the time. So this is not something that I've come up with and this is the only thing I know, but this is something that we all know. But it's so difficult to try and implement it in our life. The story of Ruth at the bottom level, or should I say the grassroots level, is a story about the faithfulness, the loyalty, right? The love, and the reliability of God. God's chesed. Remember chesed, compassionate loyalty, that God's love is sure, that his character can be trusted. He will not let you fall through. Now, it doesn't mean you are not going to experience famine. It doesn't mean people aren't going to die. It doesn't mean you're not going to experience hard things, but God is reliable. Amen. And can be trusted to be there with you and to work on your behalf. And yes, it is often frustrating because often it is literally at the 11th hour. Well, one of my favorite writers is a man by the name of Friedrich Buchner. He writes many Christian books and many commentaries and stuff like that. And he actually passed away last year. And he tells a story in his writing about a powerful moment in the life of his family. His daughter was in hospital and she was battling for her life. And Buchner was depressed and overwhelmed with everything that his family was going through. Now, a man of faith, he knew about the character of God, but just like the rest of us, we allowed the circumstances around him to overwhelm him. And as he tells the story, he pulls his car off to the side of the road, and he's sitting there just engulfed in sadness and despair. It was in that moment where he looks up and he saw a car that was passing by. And on the license plate of this car was one word. And Frederick Buchner says that of all the words in a dictionary, it was the word I most needed to see and hear in that moment. And the word on the license plate was trust. Okay. Now, he would later learn that the car belonged to a trust officer at a local bank. But he said, in that moment, I knew this wasn't a coincidence. This was a holy reminder that God was with me and that I could trust in his character. Now, if you want to become the kind of person who has the capacity to see God's hidden presence in your story, we've got to become the kind of people who turn our attention from our own circumstances, and it's difficult, it's not easy, and trust the character of God. All right. So there you have it. There is the book of Ruth. And as I look back at this 6 lectures and some of the core ideas that we have journeyed through, I can't help but feel inspired and challenged. And this is my hope that, let me just close this one window. This is my hope for you, that the story of Ruth is that you have your own transformation encounter. Now, this would be ideas that continue to inspire and challenge you. And my prayer is that may you become the kind of person who trusts the character of God. And so before we end the lecture, again, just a reminder, we're going to start on the 11th of September. And we're going to look at this. Jesus spent 90% of his time ministering around the Sea of Galilee. Now, why not Jerusalem? Why not any other parts of the country? Why not Bethlehem or Nazareth? The answer is simply location, location, location. And for those of us who were doing the previous lecture, you remember how important location is. So following the arrest of John the Baptist, Matthew's gospel tells us that Jesus withdrew to Galilee. Jesus wasn't retreating. He was actually advancing. He was taking his message into the heart of the crossroad of the world. And by the end of the series, you will see this strategic brilliance of Jesus' decision to proclaim his message where would it have been the greatest impact, and why we must do the same today in our own life. So I do hope that most of you will join the next one. Any questions about the book of Ruth before we get kicked out? I think there's about 8 minutes.
I think you've covered it all. It's amazing.
Okay.
So it's to take our eyes off our own circumstances and trust in the character of God.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's not easy. It's easier said than done. We people of habit, creatures of habit, and we tend to want to focus on ourselves and that. And, it's worth trying to remember that when you find yourself in the circumstances. And again, those who've known me for a while and heard my sermon on Peter walking on the water, that's exactly what I believe was happening. Peter did walk on the water for those split few seconds. But it was when he was looking around the circumstances around him and lost focus of Jesus that he began to sink. And I think it's exactly the same thing in our lives.
I love the chorus, trust and obey.
That's it. Beautiful.
And I often, it just comes to mind, and it's just so nice. We've just got to trust him. We mustn't trust our own, ourselves. We must look to him and trust him.
That's right. Thanks, Pauline. Yeah. All right, guys. So I hope to see some of you in our next series. If you are joining, just WhatsApp me privately, and then I'll just enroll you as in previous times. May you be blessed wherever you are in the world and or in the country, and hopefully we'll see each other soon. And I will keep in contact with you with regarding to what I'm going to be doing when we stop with these lectures. So I've got your contact details. I'll keep you in contact with me. Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Yes. Bye-bye.
So much, Stefan. It's
Bye.
been a brilliant.
Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.